Welcome everyone. We're just going to give everyone a minute to log in and get all set, and then we will get started. Alrighty. As everyone settles in, I have a quick introduction before we get started. I just want to thank you all for virtually coming out tonight. I'm Gracie. I'm the events coordinator for print. A few housekeeping details before we start. We have everyone's microphones and videos turned off, just so everyone can hear and see well, because the internet is not as always reliable as we'd like. If you have any questions during the event, please feel free to enter them in the chat box on the bottom right, or you can enter them in the question and answer function, which is on the bottom bar of your screen. If you'd like a copy of Don't Turn Around, we'll link to the print page in the chat box. I also just briefly want to thank Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance for their partnership on this event. They're an invaluable organization for the promotion of literature in Maine, and we've been so fortunate to work with them on a number of events this summer and always. So now for our speakers. Megan Collins is the author of The Winter Sister. Her new book, Behind the Red Door, will be out this August 4th, and we'll link to that one as well. Jessica Barry is the author of the best-selling novel Freefall and Don't Turn Around. She now lives with her husband Simon and their two cats, Roger Livesey and Bojack Horseman, which are fantastic cats, in Portland. So please join me in virtually welcoming Megan Collins and Jessica Barry.
Hi, thanks so much for having us. And I'm afraid that Roger Livesey is actually here with us right now.
That's the best. That's the best possible thing that could have happened.
He might keep popping up. He loves attention. As soon as he knows the camera's on, he's like ready for action.
So I just want to start by saying I'm really excited to be talking to you about your new book, Don't Turn Around. I loved it so much. I read it in 2 days. I couldn't put it down.
Thank you.
And so I just want to start by giving you the opportunity just to tell everybody what the book is about for those who haven't read it. I'm assuming you could probably describe it better than I could, so.
I'll try. So the novel opens with two women in a car, and they're driving through the night on this very deserted road in the middle of the desert. And as the reader, you don't know how they know each other, where they're going, what their final destination is, but you know that there is palpable tension between them in the car, and you can tell that they both feel a sense of danger. And that's heightened when this pair of headlights appears from the darkness and this truck starts chasing them. And at first they kind of write it off as maybe it's like, you know, a road rage incident, or maybe it's some teenagers who were bored and deciding to have some fun. But the truck comes back and it comes back and comes back, and soon you realize that it's out for blood, and it wants to kill one of them. And so the women in the car have to figure out who could be behind the wheel, because it's dark out, they can't see inside the truck at all. And that leads you into the stories of these two women's lives and how they've ended up intertwining. And so really it's about, it's really a sort of story of how if you're a woman, there's danger everywhere for you. And it's not a matter of, oh, it's, you know, of who, but it could be anyone.
Yeah. I know that a lot of times with thrillers, the word like heart pounding gets passed around a lot, but I really, as I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, like my heart was pounding, because it's so, like, those scenes are really exciting, the action of them, but it's also like, we as the readers, it could be all these different people or somebody that we don't know about yet who's coming after them. And all those possibilities have like a different consequence that would be behind them for one of these women. And so like, I just found those scenes to be so compelling, and just like, I couldn't read them fast enough, like I said. But then on the other side of that, the chapters where you really get into their stories and the background and how they got to here was equally compelling. And I love how this book pairs this emotional, nuanced story of the fight for women's reproductive rights, really, with that chase thriller. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, the development of that idea, and particularly the idea of pairing both of those. Because what I'm most curious about when I was reading this, I was like, I wonder what came first. Like, did you want to write about this subject and then you thought of this as the right way to tell it, or were these always married together from the start? So if you could talk about that.
Sure. So the first kind of germ of the idea of this book came when I read this article about these charities that do exist throughout America that provide women who are seeking abortions with transportation and lodging if they can't, provide them for themselves. And part of that is because there's, as everybody knows, been this huge push to limit reproductive rights in America, particularly in certain states, and those have been successful enough that in some parts of America, you have to travel hundreds of miles to the nearest clinic. And so when I read about those charities that are often just kind of like one woman bands, it's like one woman in a community who sees that there's the need for this and decides to step up. And sometimes those charities are providing money for that, but other times there are women who are actually driving these women to the clinics. And I became fascinated by the idea of the dynamic in that car. What would it be like if you are in the position of volunteer and having to ferry this woman who's in a potentially very vulnerable state to a clinic, which, the atmosphere surrounding a lot of these clinics is often quite hostile. And also, like, what is it like to be the woman who needs the procedure, who is at this place in her life where she's dealing with something immensely personal and she has to trust a stranger to help her, with that. And so that was the kind of thing that really started me thinking about it. And from there, I was thinking, okay, well, that's like one, that's one issue that women face, and that's one potential area of danger, but really there are so many other areas that could throw up danger. And I didn't want it to be a kind of straightforward, it's definitely like, you definitely know that it's somebody who is, has a specific bent that's after them. I wanted to look at actually like the reality of female experience, which is that, yes, like, attempting to obtain an abortion has danger, but so does going on the internet. So does, working, so does going to a bar. There's so many layers of danger that we face really as women. And it's become almost this kind of like white noise, I think. And so I wanted to kind of turn that noise up and listen to like the different frequencies of it.
Yeah, I love that. And that kind of segues into a question I was going to ask a little later, but I think it's a good time for it. So most of the chapters, for anyone who hasn't read the book, are honing in on Cait and Rebecca's perspectives. But there are these other chapters where you bring in different men's perspectives that are sort of on the periphery of this story. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, about the choice to give some voice to the men and to give them a space in this book, which I thought was really interesting.
Thanks. And actually, it was more I think it was two things. It was like curiosity on my part to like try to flesh out what the motives of these men would be and their kind of like inner workings and their inner lives. And I didn't want it to be like, there's just a sort of, he is the bad person and these are the good people. I wanted to feel a little bit more fleshed out. And also it was sort of by dint of necessity, because inherently the book is really claustrophobic, right? You have these two characters who are in a car, and that's the world that you have to work with. So I wanted to try to like keep that sense of compression inside the car, but have more of a sense of like the expanse of the world outside of it through those voices. So that's really where it came from. And part of it was, I think, when I set out, I wrote this book in a very frankly stupid way at first, where I rather than just like writing it in a linear way, which is really how you should go about writing a book, I instead like wrote a bunch of these like snippets, but without like piecing them to, like, I was just kind of like, oh, I'll sew them together when it's finished and it'll be fine. And of course it was a disaster and I had to do a ton of reworking to it. But I think like because I approached it in that way, it allowed me to like sort of see where those voices were going to go and pick out like which ones were working and which ones weren't, and which ones were interesting and which ones weren't. And so even though it ended up being a very inefficient writing process, it kind of let me explore that a little bit more.
Yeah. And I really admired the way that, you know, because some of those male characters that you do tap into, like, they're not great and they can be kind of villainous, but I really admired the way that you didn't just paint them as this like cartoonish bad guy, that even if we as the audience, as the reader, completely disagree with their actions, like they are able to justify them. And so it just makes the character very real. And I thought that worked beautifully in the book.
Thanks.
So then I want to talk about Cait and Rebecca in particular, their characters. And I think I might be so interested in this question I'm going to ask because I usually tend to write, and I'm drawn to writing in first person. But this book is written in third person. So while you're switching back and forth between these two characters' viewpoints, it's still this continuous narrator. It's not actually their voices. But I was wondering if there's a different way you approached the writing of their chapters to create a voice within that narrator that was particular to each of those characters. And can you talk a little bit about that development?
Yeah, so that I think was developed more in character background stuff. So what I try to do whenever I start writing something is to just like write bits of dialogue or even bits of plot from what I think of as their voice, or like what I'm trying to get to is their voice. And so I started out, I think, with Cait being the main narrator, and it was in first person, but I wanted to kind of get that sense of like a greater world, and I thought that it would be too bitty, I guess, if you had like two first person points of view and then all of these third person. It just felt like it was going to be too much. And so the move to third person was to kind of make it more coherent, I guess. And also I think it gave me, because Freefall was in first person, and usually I write in first person, and I prefer to write in first person because I think it allows you to get a little bit closer to the characters. But in this instance, I kind of wanted to have a little bit of distance from these women, because I knew that as the reader, you were getting to know them, and also as strangers in this car, they were getting to know each other too. So doing it in third person let me have a little bit more distance so that I could withhold more information, both from the reader, but also from like the two characters. Because I think that if you're in first person, it's harder to withhold in a way that doesn't feel tricksy, I'd say, especially if you have like all of these other plates in the air. So yeah, that was the choice. But it was, again, as ever with my writing process, a chaotic and inefficient choice.
But it got you there, so it's fine.
Yeah.
So kind of jumping off of that question, because Cait and Rebecca are very different women and they come from very different lives. So did you set out for them to sort of be like foils of each other? They're not totally foils in the sense, I mean, like, obviously Cait has chosen to put herself in this position where she's in this car with this woman, so she has certain beliefs and things. But can you talk about how you were thinking of them in terms of separate characters who could find something in each other? Were you looking for them to be very different to start, or did they just kind of come the way they came and they interacted as they would.
And I think I wanted them to be quite different. And I think that the main thing that I was thinking about was more of a sort of generational thing. So Cait is like mid 20s and Rebecca is mid 30s. And I'm in my late 30s. So I'm closer to Rebecca on the spectrum of things. And it's funny because I think that there's a pretty big gulf between those two ages. I think always there's like, that's 10 years is a lot and 25 to 35 is a lot. But I think specifically for women at this particular moment, like I remember when the Me Too stuff was blowing up, and I grew up very much I'm like very much like a 90s kid, and there was like a sense of like that we were like past the whole like sexual harassment thing. We were like all free and liberated, and like if you made a big deal of it, then you were like, it was kind of like, oh, you're not fun. It was like a weird sort of culture around it. And so when the Me Too stuff started happening, I realized that like my initial reaction was a little bit like, oh, like was that a big deal? Oh, like, you know what, that stuff like that happened to me, and like I was fine. And then I talked to women who I was working with at the time who were in their mid to late 20s, and they were like, this is terrible and it should never be tolerated, and it's like straight up bullshit. And I was like, oh, of course, like you guys have just like made a leap that like our generation didn't quite make. And so I was like really interested in that gulf, because it felt like up until then I was like thought of them being like sort of my peers, where I was like, oh, like we're not that different. And then I was like, oh, actually, like there is, I think I think my generation is a little bit more inclined to like play. I think we are the last generation that believed that if you worked within the system would work for you. And I think that anyone who's younger than us is like, it's not like the system doesn't work, like because they're like, they grew up, after the 2008 crash, and they saw that like all of those things that, we were all told that if you work hard and do good, you can achieve, like weren't actually there for them. And so that was the kind of thing that like I liked the idea of like Rebecca is very much like a rule follower, and she wants to like be good and do good. And I think there's like a bit of kind of like Lisa Simpson in her, where she's like, if I just work really hard at this, then I'm going to make it work. And Cait's the younger one, and I think she's more like, if this is going to work, I have to make it work for myself, and like I have to do whatever it takes to make it work, because I can't wait around for somebody or something to make it work for me. So that was like the kind of starting point, was that generational thing, and then their individual like quirks kind of came from there.
Yeah, I love that. And kind of going off of what you were saying, like when you were talking to certain people, which maybe had nothing to do with this book, but I was thinking that, with everything you get into the book, in the book, that I'm assuming you did some research of some kind, but you didn't just like pop it all out there. But I'm wondering if the research you did was more kind of anecdotal from hearing stories from women who had been through these kinds of situations, or if it was kind of a more academic type of thing. And can you just talk a little bit about that?
It was sort of both. So I wrote, and it kind of depended on the subject. So for the reproductive rights stuff, that was more like reading articles about it, and also like reading those firsthand accounts. For things like, there's a string in the book that's about white male supremacy online and like incel culture, and that was a dark dark few weeks of me like lurking around on like chat room boards, listening to just the worst stuff that you can ever imagine. but it was interesting, that in particular was interesting, was because you could see the progression. You could see how people were getting indoctrinated. You know, you could see that some people were turning up to these like incel chat rooms just legitimately wanting like advice on how to approach women, and they were clearly like teenagers, and they were like, you know, this girl looked at me in the hallway and like, should I try to talk to her? And you could see how quickly like it spirals into this real like just dark heart of nothingness, you know. And so that was like yeah, that's the I wish I could scrub that bit from my brain, but it was actually really helpful to read that stuff in real time and to see like what kind of information is actually exchanged in those places, because I think it's like one of those things everybody, you know, hears about, this idea of like these like 4chan places and like Reddit to a certain degree, and you know, these kind of like cesspools of white supremacy and stuff like that, but like actually reading it myself was helpful to like inform the character, and also inform like how the tactics, I guess, that would be used.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was saying before about how the men in the book, like, they can justify their actions, and a lot of that is because they're around other men who can justify their actions and lead them down that path of thinking.
For sure.
Yeah, so those are all the questions that I had for you, and thank you so much, because that added so much insight to this book that I already loved, and now like I want to read it again with all this in mind.
Oh, thanks.
Was there anything else you wanted to say about the book?
No, I think you like really covered it. Thank you. So let's talk about you. Ready?
Okay.
So I've got your book. Here it is.
I have it too.
I finished it yesterday. I absolutely loved it. I really loved The Winter Sister. I thought that it was like such a smart book about mother-daughter relationships, but this feels like more sinister, I'd say. Like it feels like scarier. And so will you just talk a little bit about what the book's about?
Yeah, so when the book opens, it's this character named Fern, and she's in her apartment in Boston, and she has the news on, and she sees this story on the news about a missing woman named Astrid Sullivan, who's 34, and she's looking at her and she's saying to her husband, I know that woman, like she's really familiar to me. And he says, well, yeah, that's Astrid Sullivan. And she's like, I don't know what that is. Like, who is that? And he says, that really famous woman who was kidnapped when she was a kid, when she was 14. And so Fern is like, I have absolutely no memory of that. I don't know what you're talking about, but he's insisting she's like this household name, like everybody would have heard of her. And so the story about this Astrid Sullivan is that when she was 14, she was kidnapped kind of near her house while there was this party for her, and nobody saw what happened. And then she spent a month in a basement that had this red door, hence the title, Behind the Red Door. And there was this masked man. She never knew who he was. And then a month later, he just kind of returns her to her home, and she's found near her house on the curb and kind of drugged, so she doesn't remember what's going on. And so it's been 20 years, and now the news is saying that she's missing again. That it appears that somebody has kidnapped her again, and people are really worried that it was the same person who took her 20 years ago, because she just had a memoir come out called Behind the Red Door that is all about that time. And so Fern is like sure that she knows her, but she does not know anything about this kidnapping. She kind of had like sort of a sheltered childhood in a lot of ways. And but then that night she has this dream that she has a lot about this faceless girl who's kind of like reaching out to her. And that night, for the first time, the girl has Astrid Sullivan's face. And she starts to wonder, oh my God, was this never a dream? Was this a memory or something? But she doesn't know, because she also suffers from like acute anxiety. And so she doesn't know if it's just her anxiety playing with her. And so she's going back to her hometown to help her psychologist father move. And he is quite a character. He throughout her childhood, he studies fear, and so he would kind of do these like fear experiments on her. And so when he starts to see that she is like, something's weird going on, like I feel like I have this connection to this woman, he's like, oh well, we should study that, like that's interesting. So he's kind of pushing her to that, but like in ways that make her very uncomfortable. And she starts reading the memoir and visiting people and places in it to try to figure out why she feels this connection to this woman, and then things kind of go from there. Yes. And so it kind of goes back and forth in the book from Fern's chapters and then excerpts of the memoir.
Yeah, so that's actually one of my questions, is like how you made those choices. So it's two first-person narrators of Fern and Astrid, but Astrid's is told through excerpts of her memoir. So I like, what made you decide to use that as a vehicle, which I thought worked really, really well?
Thank you. I think it was kind of like you said, it was sort of out of necessity that I needed some way that there could be this information that Fern is getting about the past. Mm-hmm. And also a way for us to see Astrid's story and to like care about her and the fact that she's missing again. And so I wanted to do that. And I think I kind of, I don't know, I think readers, we like books within books a lot, because It's like 2 books for the price of 1. And so, yeah, I really wanted to play with that. And it was difficult at first because, you know, when you have a character's voice in your head, you're sticking to that voice, and it just kind of becomes a part of every way that you think. So I was going back and forth through these, and I had to figure out a way to make them feel a little more distinct, since they are both first person narratives. And so I found, though, that as I was writing Fern, because of her anxiety and the fact that she like is so nervous about literally everything, when I was writing her, I was writing kind of these clipped quick sentences. And so like everything she would say would be kind of then like sentence fragment, mm-hmm. because that just felt real to me for what she was going through, because everything's kind of like, there's always a threat. And so then, and that was kind of different from my usual writing style, which tends to be like a little more flowing. So that gave me the freedom then in writing Astrid's voice to then be a little bit more like poetic with some of the language, and to have her have this more kind of lyrical voice. Mm-hmm. And so that was fun, actually, to be able to do both of those in the same book.
Yeah, and I think it was very clever in that, you know, so much of the book is about trying to figure out what's real and what's not. You know, so Fern's trying to figure out if the memories that are coming back to her are real, or if they are because she's reading this memoir and is already in this state of kind of heightened anxiety and has gone through all of these sort of psychological experiences as a child, which I wanted to talk about. And then for Astrid's memoir, like the thing about a memoir is that there's an added layer of how trustworthy and how accurate is this actually, because you're not hearing directly from her about what's happening. You're hearing her in a published, polished form. And I thought that was really interesting, because then you're like, can I even trust, this is meant to be like a document that Fern is trusting, but can I even trust that what she's writing is exactly what happened, or does she have some sort of ulterior motive as to why she would be writing what she's writing? Yeah. But I wanted to talk particularly about the book is so much about sort of psychology and Fern's childhood in particular, and like kind of ongoing adult relationship with her father is based on him essentially using her as a kind of test subject. Where did you come up with this idea? Is it based in something that, like in anything like real life? And how did you research it? 3 parts.
You mean in terms of the Ted aspect, of the father aspect?
Yeah.
I don't even, it kind of scares me to think like where he came from.
He's such a great character. He's fascinating.
Thank you. He's crazy. and I think somebody recently said that they were talking, I can't even remember, one of my friends was saying, telling me that I write bad parents well, and that they thought it was strange because they said, like, you're very well adjusted, you have like a normal life, it seems. But I think I am really interested in that, and the idea of a bad parent and what does that look like, because it doesn't always look like the same thing. And as we see in the book, like Ted had a bad parent, the father had a bad parent, but it's not manifesting in exactly the same way that it manifests for him towards Fern. And a lot of Fern's journey in this book, even though her husband is like, why are you going to even help him move? Like, why are you trying to have this relationship? Like, she just wants to keep to keep like proving to herself that there is some love there, that she's a child who's loved. And I think actually the little seed of that idea was that I wanted to write, among all the other things that the book is trying to do, I wanted to write about a toxic relationship and what it's going to take for you to walk away from that toxic relationship. So, you know, whereas most parents, I would think, if they're hearing that their child is having these like terrifying memories of like something of seeing this girl maybe that got kidnapped, like they would be like, oh my gosh, like let's go get you some help, like what can we do? But Ted is just like, oh, I can use that. I can use that for part of my studies. Like, that's great. And so like, how much is it going to take for Fern to finally say that's enough? And so that's part of her journey in the book. So that's really where Ted came from for me. I wanted to like see how bad could I make this character, but also like he is really bad, but I find him very interesting.
Yeah, he's very he's oddly charming, because and I feel like you really get a sense of that his heart is in the right place in terms of like the way that he is. I think that he thinks that I don't think he thinks that he's doing her any harm.
Right.
And I don't think he ever thought that. I think that he thinks that she is there to help him and wants to help him, and because she wants to help him, that means that she's happy, which means that he's being a good parent because he's making her happy. So it's really, and he's just like a very, you get a sense that he's like this kind of tortured, brilliant man who lives in his head and sees only the work. And I think that is like a very accurate portrayal of that certain type of like obsessive genius where everything is like subsumed within the work, you know?
Yeah.
And I also thought that it was interesting because obviously Fern has a difficult relationship with both of her parents, really. And her mother really isn't necessarily, she's sort of like an absentee parent. And Astrid also has a difficult relationship with her parents in a way, and that her parents are extremely religious, and she is a lesbian, and she's kind of like figuring this part of herself out when she's a teenager, and they reject it. And so I thought that it was really interesting that both Astrid and Fern become sort of vessels for their parents' like desires for them and their notions of them. And I wanted to just see if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, when I was thinking again about that idea of toxic relationships and what makes a relationship toxic, that was one of the things I kept coming to, where you see the other person only as the way you want to see them and not how they truly are. And you can't get around that. You can't be like, oh, okay, I was wrong, this is how you are. Like, you keep going to where you think they are. And so for Fern and Astrid, Fern lives this life as a child where she's like pretty much neglected by her parents, both because they're off doing their work and then they're only kind of using her when Ted is like, oh, this could be beneficial. And I wanted then, because of that, I wanted Astrid to kind of be the flip side of that her parents are so involved with her life, and that it's another kind of oppressiveness and another kind of pain for her, that you know, they catch her making out with a girl in the basement, so they take the door off of her bedroom, and things like that. And she's getting confirmed in the Catholic Church, so they have the hugest party ever to be like, see, our daughter she's the angel. Mm. And so I really wanted to show the two sides of that coin of like kind of taking yourself out of the equation as a parent and then inserting yourself way too much. Although Ted definitely inserts himself in ways that he shouldn't either. But in terms of how each girl was interpreting their own childhood and their relationship with their parents.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of things, like Fern is not realizing a lot of these things until she's older. And I think that when we see Astrid's perspective, it's all through the memoir. So obviously she's had a long time to think about these things and process what really happened with her parents. So I'm just really interested in that, because I think that there's toxicity in both of those things. And I think, you know, it doesn't, if you like ignore your kid because you're working or something, or you're like too involved with their life for a second, like you're not instantly a bad parent. It's like, when that is your way of parenting them, that is your only way, I think that's when it gets kind of unhealthy and dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that like what you talked about in terms of like interpretation and perception, I think is really interesting too, because I don't think that when Fern was little, I don't think that she felt like anything was wrong. It was only when she kind of got space from her childhood that she started to think something is wrong. And Astrid too, like, you know, her first reaction when she's kidnapped is to think that she deserves it. Is that like, this is like, of course, like this is something that should happen to me because I didn't follow these rules. And I thought that like that, like the way that you played with perception and interpretation of the past and of memory is really interesting, because I think that everybody has, you know, everybody looks back on their childhood and thinks, oh, like this is how it was. And I think that if you actually like interrogated your childhood self, they would have a very different view of like what was actually occurring at the time, because that's just how memory works, you know. Well, I loved it, and I'm really excited for it to come out, which is on the 4th of August.
Yes, August 4th. And we've got some questions. So this one looks like it's for both of us, so we can both talk about it. How do you plan when to reveal certain bits of information? Logistically, are there techniques that you use, like index cards? Writing-wise, how do you feel out the pace of your writing? So you want to start with that?
Sure. I wish that I had like some sort of system or anything like that. Really, it's like, for me, I always want to be somebody who's like a careful plotter who knows what they're doing, and I never am. Like, I will start out with what I think is a plot, and I'll have an outline and I'll have all that stuff, and then it just always goes haywire. So for me, I tend to figure out the reveals as I go, I would say. I think I have like rough benchmarks of like around I guess I split it really into quarters. So it's like at the first quarter, there should be some sort of thing in which, some sort of reveal. The midway point, there should be, I think, a twist that sort of makes the reader think, oh, okay, like maybe it's different than what I thought. Maybe this book is a different kind of book than what I thought I was reading. And then probably another at the 3/4 point, I would say, where it's like the kind of final, like big twist, and then kind of work to the ending from there. But that's like very loose. And I wish that I had a better system, but really it's just like a ton of rewriting and figuring it out, and like things coming to me at the least opportune times, like if I'm like in the middle of a yoga session or like in a shower, like always at random points where I can't get to a pen.
Or you're almost asleep.
Oh, I'm almost asleep, classic. That's really irritating. What about you? I hope you have a better system than me.
Well, I think I am sort of more on the other side of the spectrum, but it's to like an obnoxious extent. Like, I think I am a way over planner, and everything is so detailed, but only like I've always been like that. Like when I was writing papers in college, like I had to almost like write the thing as an outline first before I could write it out. So I I always know going in kind of like what the midpoint twist or reveal is, what the ending is, what the other twists are, and then I outline by building in those beats in between that, and that usually, that is where I start to get to know the characters, and really feel for the story. And so like I'll have a big outline for the whole thing, and then right before I'm going to write a chapter, I write a new outline just for the chapter. So I have like all these documents before I actually do it, but it really helps me. Like I feel like I know where I'm going. And sometimes people are like, well, doesn't that take away kind of the joy and the magic of the writing? And I can kind of see that too, but I think there's joy in figuring things out in those outlines. I mean, it's not always joy. It's always like, oh my God, what am I doing? But so, you know, and there's still surprises that comes up. And that's the thing that I love, that you can outline a thing to death and think you know exactly where you're going, but the characters will do things that you never expect.
For sure. Your system sounds a lot better than mine.
Well, I think it's so fascinating. I love hearing about other authors' techniques and processes, because everybody works their own way, but we all end up with a thing in the end. And so it's cool, like all the different ways to get there. And you can't tell someone this is the way to do it, because you just have to find what works for you.
Yeah.
So another question, how do you both test drafts of your book to make sure there's enough conflict/tension? What are some of your strategies for ramping up conflict and tension?
I think I often need the stakes ramped up in mind. I think that because in real life I'm like a very placid person, so I don't have like huge like highs and lows of emotion. Like I'm pretty steady, so it means that I will often like not take things to the extremes that they need to be taken to in the first draft. And I would say like my husband is very good at identifying this and being like, this is not like shocking enough. Like, you need to have some blood shed and, you know, have something terrible happen. But that's usually like in a later draft. So I think that that's when all that stuff gets worked out. Like, is that I have a hard time, I think, figuring out like what needs to be ratcheted up when I'm writing it. Oh, here comes my cat again. It's only like when I get some distance from it that I can see it and figure out like, okay, like this bit works, this bit needs to be taken up a notch. How about you?
Yeah, I think I might be again on the other end of it, where my inclination is always to be like all the tension all the time, and obviously that's not good, because you need those breaks where the reader can breathe, where the characters can breathe and process everything that's happened. Because if you have them constantly having these like crazy things happen, there's no room for them to process and then grow. So I do kind of have to like remember to build in those moments of, just because I always want to be like, here's the exciting thing, but you need to have those breaks too. But I think also like in terms of the idea of testing the drafts, like my husband also kind of acts as a first reader a lot for me. But just like to go from a time when I was writing and didn't have like a relationship with an editor or anything, but now to have an editor and know like as I'm working on this book right now that is going to be my next book, there's so many things that I'm like, I feel like something is missing or something's off, but she'll figure it out. She'll tell me, like, I'm not even going to worry about it. She'll tell me. And like, obviously I'm trying to get it to the best place it can be before I send it to her. But like, that is such a gift to know that there's somebody there who's going to tell you if the tension's not high enough or if there's too much tension.
Yeah, I have editors to do that, and I also have I'm very lucky that my best friend is a children's book editor. So she poor Katie often gets like if I'm starting out something, I'll send her like the first 10,000 words and be like, is this working, and she's like always able to carefully guide me in the right direction, and is also really the only person who can say to me, no, start again, and without me completely having a meltdown. So yeah, it's really important to have those set of eyes.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of ways, like people have critique partners, people get beta readers, and I think like we do sort of write in a vacuum, but you can't really edit in a vacuum, because how would you know what to do? Because it's your same eyes looking at it, even if you take some time. So yeah, this question is for you. You mentioned that you started with the idea of one woman driving another to get an abortion. How did you manage to piece an entire book together from all your random scraps of info, ideas, and stories?
It took a long time. It's very hard. Well, so yeah, that was like the kind of like initial thing. And then I was like, okay, like what else, what else, what else? And I think that's like the question that you're always asking as a writer is like, what else, what else, what else? And I knew actually like as soon as I started writing it, I realized that the problem I was going to run up against was the fact that like essentially it's just two women in a car, and that is hard to, you can't like, I'm sure somebody who's a much better writer than me can like write an entire novel that is just set within a car. But I soon was like, oh, okay, like I need other stuff to be happening. I need other things to make this more interesting, because otherwise there's just like, especially since it was like the desert at night, it's like I can't even describe anything. it's like just flat nothingness, you know. So it kind of came, yeah, it was just me really interrogating it and trying to figure out what else I could add and explore, and who else I could bring into the story to make it, to give it texture.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, like the scenes where they are in the car, I think to have a whole book like that, it would be that thing of the tension the entire time, and there would never be any break, because those chapters were so tense, whether it was because there was a truck like on their butt as they're going, or because there's that tension between them as they know things and don't know things. So again, I know I already said this, but I loved the back and forth between those two. I thought it worked amazing.
Thanks.
Question for both of us. Who are you reading now, and who do you read for inspiration? It's a great question.
So my big three for inspiration are Laura Lippman, who I think is just so good. Dennis Lehane, who I think is so good at like atmosphere and sense of place and dialogue. So if I'm ever feeling like stuck, then I'll reread Mystic River, because I think it's a complete masterpiece. And I also really love Gillian Flynn, as everybody does. But in particular, like Sharp Objects, I'd say, is, I mean, it's just so good. And the fact that it was her debut is just like enough to make you sick, but admiringly so. And I also just recently started reading Megan Abbott, who I never read before, and I'm really liking her. She's so good at like teenage, like girlhood, like that kind of like sinister nest that you can get in with friendships. So yeah, those are some of my favorites. What about you?
Well, I actually haven't read Mystic River, but Angie Kim says the same thing about Mystic River as just being like her go-to book, and how it kind of taught her how to write a thriller type of thing, or like a psychological piece. But so I tend to, for inspiration, I tend to lean toward authors that have like a really lyrical sense to their writing. So like Toni Morrison is my all-time favorite. Just like, I can't even, just like the most gorgeous storyteller of all time. I really love Emily St. John Mandel, who did Station 11, and her most recent book, The Glass Hotel, is just gorgeous. So when I think about like Alice Hoffman is another, who just like the writing on like a sentence by sentence level, like it's just so poetic. But right now I've been reading like a bunch of different things, like really different genres, because I like to kind of get out of, I read a lot of thrillers, but I like to see what else is going on. So right now I'm reading The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which is my first book by her. And it's fantasy, but it's very timely, and it's really interesting. And I love that, like, I love just feeling like I can learn something from like a completely different genre, and then find some way to pull those in. Question for both of us. Have you always written mysteries / thrillers? How did you get your start?
No, I haven't. I used to write romantic comedies. So I wrote 3 rom-coms, which were published by Penguin in the UK, and had a lot of fun writing them. And then basically realized that, like, number one, I sort of was running out of romantic material. And I also like came up with I had the idea for Free Fall and thought it would be really interesting to kind of like try my hand at something else. And I don't know if you feel like this, but I feel like thrillers and suspense are such a good vehicle to like talk about like broader themes. Like they kind of act as this like perfect Trojan horse where you can kind of like sneak in the stuff that you want to talk about that's important to you, while still like making it like compulsive and pacey and like an entertaining read. And rom-coms, it's like harder to, you can do it, but it's just a little trickier.
Yeah.
What about you?
So the first 2 books that I wrote, which didn't end up getting published, they were more like I guess what they call women's fiction, kind of just contemporary, like family dramas kind of things. But they both had sort of this like dark bent to them. And so I think what happened when I wrote The Winter Sister is that I just like gave into the darkness and that's how it ended up being like a psychological suspense book.
Yeah.
And I remember, I tell this story a lot, that like when people first started identifying it as a thriller, I was like, a thriller? I didn't write a thriller. And then I was like, oh, I get it.
Oh, wait, I did.
I guess I did. But I was thinking of it still of just like the story I was telling. So I didn't necessarily set out to start writing thrillers. It just was the story I wanted to tell. And I'm really glad that I did, because like you said, there's so much to explore there. And I think the genre is really, really rich. Okay, so that's the last question. So thank you so much for this talk and everything. I love
Thank you. It's been really fun. I really loved talking to you. It's been great.
Yeah.
And I can't wait for everybody to read Behind the Red Door, because it's real good.
And everybody, of course, to read Don't Turn Around.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.